Today we have a brilliant positional game from Tigran Petrosian. His opponent is Dragolyob Vilamirovich, a fellow grandmaster. And one of the interesting things to watch in this game is the difference between a human approach to chess and a computer approach to chess. At one point, there's a decision that is made that a computer doesn't think anything about, but for a human, it's actually a pretty big deal. Petrosian has white, Vilamirovich has black. Let us jump right in. Petrosian begins with d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5. Looks like we're going to have a Benoni on the board. g6, knight c3, bishop to g7, and e4, obviously threatening to gain a lot of space, so black castles. And if white does go ahead, by the way, black can play knight to e8, but it's tricky. To be sure, I'm a little surprised black allowed that there. But now d6. Petrosian didn't play e5 then. Bishop to e2. And now black plays e5. Creating this, I think, called a check Benoni pawn structure, where you have this locked structure in the middle of the board, and pawn breaks are going to dominate. Black has a potential f5 pawn break, as well as a potential b5 pawn break. And white also has a b4 pawn break, among other possibilities. Bishop to g5 for Petrosian. That was his signature move in these King's Indian type structures, slowing down black's play. Black wants to move the knight to play f5, but now the knight cannot move because it is pinned. Just slows black's play a little bit. h6, bishop to h4, maintaining the pin. Queen to d7, stepping out of the pin. And this is a very interesting move, and it leads into the question I brought up at the start, the idea I brought up at the start. What would a computer do? Knight to d2 from Petrosian, so that when this knight moves and f5 is played, he can respond with f3, maintaining a fluid pawn structure. Knight to e8, the pawn moves, preparing this f5 pawn break. And here, Petrosian plays queen to a4, offering the exchange of queens. Now, a computer doesn't really mind whether or not the queens are exchanged. But from a human point of view, I consider this to be a pretty big problem for black. In these structures, black really likes to play f5 and attack on the king side. And with the queens off the board, that attack is not as potent as it would be with queens on. And I would say, unless you're a top GM or a computer, you do not want to exchange queens in this position as black. And knowing that, Petrosian seeks the exchange of queens. Bishop to f6. Really, the queen doesn't have anywhere to go, by the way. It could go to c7, but that would be a waste of time. So bishop to f6, queen takes, knight takes d7, bishop takes f6, knight df6. In the computers, the evaluation doesn't change, but from a human perspective, white with the space advantage, I think, is better here. Now, we can look at the bishops. White's bishop is technically bad because it's blocked in by the pawns, and black's bishop is technically good because it isn't. But if you actually look at the mobility and available squares for the bishops, white's bishop is just as good as black's, because white's pawns limit the black bishop just as much as it limits its own. So rook to b1, preparing the b4 pawn break, knight to d7, clearing the way for f5, and also helping to defend c5 after b4. f3, maintaining the fluid pawn structure, f5, and Petrosian decides to go ahead and take on f5, and that does leave an isolated h-pawn, but black has a nice pair of pawns here, and again, with queens on the board, these pawns would be much more potent, but white has ways of dealing with this. The way Petrosian deals with these two pawns is very instructive. g3, eventually this pawn could go to g4, but also f4 could be played. Knight d to f6, castling. h5. Vilamirovich would love to play h4 and liquidate that pawn weakness and get that off of the board. But here Petrosian plays f4. Now that does reveal an attack on this pawn. Of course, the pawn is defended at the moment. But it allows Vilamirovich to make this move, e4. And this is a very instructive moment. So this is a protected passed pawn, right? I mean, this should be a strategic advantage. But in this position, it is not. And the reason is because this square on e3, the square in front of the pawn, Petrosian can put a knight on that square, blockade the pawn, and a knight on e3 will be very powerful, constantly putting pressure on the f5 pawn from e3. So Petrosian is actually okay with this passed pawn for black. He allowed it to occur. Knight to d1, moving the knight to the e3 square, preparing that blockade. Bishop to d7, just clearing the back rank and maybe preparing d5. Knight to e3. The knight is very well placed, applying pressure to f5. b6, a3, aiming for the b4 advance. And now h4. A very interesting moment. Again, against most players, this would be a good move. Against even a GM, this would be a good move. But against an elite player, someone who is world champion, this is not such a great move, because a player of that caliber can take the pawn, hold it, and win with it. They can play accurately enough that even with the pawn weaknesses in the structure, they're going to be fine. So Petrosian goes ahead and takes. And yes, he has 3 very ugly pawns. But if he can keep these pawns protected, he's going to have a passed h-pawn. King to f7 to allow the rooks to move over to the g file and the h file. Rook f to c1. Rook to h8, attacking the pawn at h4. And now knight to g2. He holds on to the pawns. He holds on to the extra material. And now this other knight actually can go to f1 and e3, so he can both protect the pawns and maintain the blockade on the e3 square. Knight to g7. The knight can come into h5 and maybe put some pressure on the f4 pawn. Knight to f1. Again, it can go to e3 or it can go to g3, either one. Rook a to g8, building on the king's side. Now rook to c3. This is a common defensive move in King's Indian structures for white. They'll play a move to the rook to c3, or if the pawn is at a4, they'll play rook to a3 and defend laterally. And it's a very important move here. Knight g to h5. Now knight to g3. That's playable because this rook is on c3 and holds that knight. It would be a real mistake to take there, because then he could just retake with the pawn, and now the pawns are restored to a healthy structure. So rook to g6. Velimirovich just continues to build up on the g file. Knight takes h5. Petrosian takes the knight at h5. Knight takes h5. Bishop h5. And rook to h5. Now the rooks can't double easily because the rook has been distracted to the h5 square. And we have a knight versus bishop endgame. The knight on its own versus the bishop on its own. But the knight is much better. Again, because of this beautiful blockading square, well, it will dominate this bishop that is limited in scope by the pawns on f5 and e4. So he'll have a superior minor piece. And for the moment, again, these pawns, these 3 weak pawns, are okay. Rook to g3, challenging the rook. And again, black does not want to take because it would just restore a healthy pawn structure. This would be totally lost for black. So rook to h8 is played. b4, finally, Petrosian breaks on the queen side. Rook to c8. The threat is to take on c5, right? And if the d-pawn takes, he gets a protected passed pawn, but black has no knight that he can blockade that pawn with, or he gets an open b-file, right? So black can't allow either one of those 2 things to happen. So he plays rook to c8 to keep c5 under control with a piece. And here Petrosian plays b5, gaining space. And at some point he's threatening perhaps to play rook to g5, and that would really make it hard for black to get at those pawns. So here black goes ahead, takes on g3, and now the health of the pawns are restored. And we can see that Petrosian is doing very well with more space, a better minor piece, and an extra pawn, which is passed on the h-file. So black plays rook to a8. He's looking for activity. He wants to play a6 and to open up the a-file. Petrosian moves the knight to that beautiful blockading square, which is still there. a6, trying to open up the a-file. Petrosian takes on a6. Rook takes a6. And here he could play rook to b3 and to sort of keep things under control. But he decides to calculate and figure out the end game. And he goes ahead and makes a committing move. He plays king to f2. The idea is after rook to a3, he'll be able to take on b6, and black will not be threatening this knight on e3, so he's now free to retake on b6. And that is what happens. Black takes on a3, Petrosian takes on b6, and again, this knight is not hanging because the king now defends it. Rook to a2 check. king to e1, rook to a1 check. Of course, black would love to check white's king forever, but Petrosian is not going to allow that to happen. He checks again, king to c1. Now rook to a3, attacks the knight, and also if the knight moves, the threat of rook to c3, taking on c4 is possible. But again, Petrosian calculates, and he plays rook takes d6. He says, if you take my knight, I will take your bishop. But what about this move? What if black were to play this nice in-between move, king to e7? Would that force the rook to move and then black win the knight on e3? No, what Petrosian would do is take the bishop with his rook. He'd give up the exchange. And after king takes rook, knight takes f5. And this knight, he would have a knight and 3 pawns versus the rook. And there's no way black can survive this endgame. White's in a perfect position to stop the one passed pawn black has. And you'll notice the knight defends the pawn at g3. This is an easily winning endgame for black. Most GMs, I think, would probably just resign with black here. And notice here, these 3 squares are unavailable to the black king. He can't get at the knight. The knight controls these 2 squares, and then e6 is controlled by the pawn. So because of that, black goes ahead and takes the knight, and they exchange minor pieces, and we have a pure rook endgame. And in this position, we talk about these GMs seeing so deep. Velimirovich actually resigned here, seeing that the rook endgame was an easy win for Petrosian. But let's see why. Let's say, of course, he's in check, so let's say he plays king to g6. Not only does that defend f5, it keeps h5 under control, but Petrosian could just play h5 here. And black cannot ignore that pawn. He would have to take it, because if he, say, play king to f6, then the pawn would just march. If the rook gets behind the pawn, this construction with the rook defending the pawn laterally along with this passed pawn would be decisive. He could check a few times. The king could just move back. And then here, he could limit the rook to these 2 squares. And after, if king to g6, he just moves the rook over. And now the pawn, the d-pawn would just advance. And if he tries to play e3, that doesn't stop anything. Petrosian can just eat the pawn with his own king and come back to the same position. So black would need to take that pawn. And after king takes h5, rook to g7 would seal it, because now the king is completely immobilized. He only has these 2 squares that he can go to. The threat of rook to g5, winning the f5 pawn along with this passed pawn, and that will be total dominance. So because of that, Velimirovich resigned in this position, seeing all of that ahead of its occurrence. So a brilliant game from Petrosian. Exchanging queens, a very human move. Computers don't care, but among human players, that's a big deal. Then that beautiful e3 square where he used his knight to blockade and dominate. And he didn't mind his pawns being ruined because he knew he could defend them and then use them to win. A brilliant game from Petrosian. I hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.